Normal maps, bump maps, and displacement maps. What's the difference? Remember the stucky texture we added in section 3 and turned normal on for it, and it gave us a grainy look for the wood? That was essentially a bump map, but it doesn't really appear to have any different function than a normal map, does it? Both normal maps and bump maps change the way light reflects off of a flat surface to make it appear that there's more height detail than there really is. The difference is that bump maps only bump the surface in one direction, whereas normal maps can go as far as making it appear that a sharp angle is actually rounded. That's why normal maps are superb for things like game models, where you're working with a low poly object which has a lot of sharper edges. The normal maps smooth out the low resolution mesh and make it appear high resolution. Bump maps can't do that. In this sense, bump maps are good for flat surfaces like a concrete floor or wood grain and things like that. Now displacement maps are bump maps that actually change the mesh itself. We brushed on this topic in the last chapter. Although we used a modifier for that, there's also a way to load a displacement map in as a texture. In this chapter, I'm going to give you an example of all three so you can see the differences. Now let's start with bump maps. Now we learned how to use this method in the materials chapter when we added wood grain to a cube, but we used a procedural texture for that. Let's learn how to create an actual bump map. So let's open up Photoshop and start a new file. Doesn't matter what size it is. I'm going to choose a black color and the paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint some squiggly lines and some straight lines. Just like that. And I'm going to save this in the textures folder as bump map. I'm going to save it as chapter 3 bump map. Now let's go back into Blender and let's add a new material for the plane. Now let's add a new texture for the plane. Change the texture type to image, and let's load in that bump map we just created. So go to the project/textures folder and load in chapter 3 bump map. Press Alt and Z for textured view, and I don't have GLSL enabled. So I'm going to go into the side menu here under the display options and enable GLSL. Alright, so we see it. I'm going to move that up a little bit away from those grid lines. We see it applied as a color map right now. But I don't want to use it as a color map. I just want to use it as a bump map. So scroll down to the influence panel, disable color influence, and enable normal. You'll see right off the bat how it works. So the black and white values of the image are used to create the bumpiness on a flat surface, or at least the illusion of bumpiness on a flat surface. Let's bring the light down, move it a little bit closer. So right now everything looks like it's being bumped down. We can change that by changing the normal value from 1 to -1, and now everything's going to bump the other way. So now it's bumping up. So that was simple enough. A bump map is just a black and white image, and those black and white or grayscale values are used to determine what parts of the surface bump up or down or stay the same. And all that by just loading in the image and enabling normal here and playing with that value if you want. So bump maps can be used for extra surface detail, giving your color maps extra realism by adding more dimension to them, by giving the illusion that the surface is bumpy. So that's all there is to bump maps. Now normal maps can achieve this as well, just as easily, but you can push normal maps even further. I'm going to delete this plane, and from top view, I'm going to add a cube. Now let me show you how we can take this cube and make it appear like it's beveled with just a normal map. I'm going to duplicate the cube and keep it in place. And now I'm going to add a bevel modifier for it with segments up to 5. So there's our beveled edges. And press the T key and click on Smooth Shading so it smooths everything out. We're going to use this cube. We're going to use all the normals, all the face directions on this cube to create a normal map for our square cube here. And that normal map is going to make it look like this has beveled edges. Now we're going to bake this high resolution mesh as a normal map onto this low resolution mesh, just like we did in the last chapter when we baked the sculpted wall that we made. So first we have to unwrap the low resolution cube. So let's drag this window over, go into edit mode, select everything and press Ctrl and E and mark all the edges as seams. I'm not worrying about unwrapping this like a box. Now press U and click on Unwrap. So here's the 6 faces of the cube. Now we need to add a new image to bake the normal map to. So go to Image and select New Image while still in edit mode with all the vertices selected. And it doesn't matter the size right now, so leave it as default. So here's the new image the normal map's going to be baked to. Let's get out of edit mode. And let's go to the render buttons. And scroll down and expand the bake panel. Change bake mode to normals. And enable selected to active. So we're going to select the high resolution cube, hold shift, and select the low resolution cube, which is now the active selection. So we're baking selected to active. Now click on bake. And here's what we get. You can see it baked all the bevels of the high resolution cube into a normal map that we're going to use for the low resolution cube now. So I'm going to select the beveled cube and move that to a hidden layer. And let's rename this in this field here to normal map. And don't forget, if you actually want to save this image, go into Image and select Save As or Save Image. Otherwise, if you don't save it and you close Blender, it just reverts back to the original black image. Now let's add a material for this. So go to the material buttons, click on New. Go to the texture buttons, click on New, and add in our new normal map as an image. Let's go to the image menu here and select our normal map. Change the mapping coordinates to UV. Expand the image sampling panel and enable normal map. Scroll all the way down to the influence panel. Disable color and enable normal. Let's move the light around. Alright, so you can see that that normal map is really trying hard to make this look like a beveled cube. But there's some problems like the corner here and seams here. We can fix that real quick by going into edit mode, going into face select mode, and selecting one face at a time, and then scaling down the UVs a little bit. The problem was that the UVs were scaled up to the point where they were including this blank area in here. So we just need to select one face at a time and scale them down a little bit in the UV window. There we go. And this is the result. So you can see how a normal map can go further than a bump map because it doesn't just bump the surface up and down. It actually makes super sharp angles look smooth if you have a good enough normal map. And this is just a regular cube with 90-degree angles on all corners. But with a normal map, it looks like it's much more detailed, much more high resolution. So that's what normal maps can do that bump maps can't. So you can begin to understand how useful something like this is in the gaming world, where you're limited to how much detail a mesh can actually have before it starts to slow things down. That's when a normal map comes into play. It can give you all that extra detail to make a low resolution mesh look like it's really detailed. Now displacement maps are a different beast. Displacement maps will actually displace the mesh. There's no illusion there. The vertices on the mesh will move based on the displacement map. So let me show you how to load in a displacement map by first deleting the material on the cube. We don't need that anymore. And let's add a new material. Go to the textures and add a new texture, and let's load in our bump map because we're going to use that as a displacement map. Change the type to image and load in chapter 3 bump map. I'm going to use UV coordinates. I know it's going to look a little crazy. So let's reset the UVs on this, because right now each face is only taking up a portion of the workspace here. With all the vertices selected, let's change the image over here to the bump map image so we can see how the UVs are laid out on the bump map texture. Let's press U and select Reset so that each face stretches to the bounds of the workspace and each face will have this entire texture. Alright, now we know that if we make this bump map, the surface is going to look like it's bumpy. But what if I actually wanted the surface to bump out and not just look like it? That's where a displacement map comes into play. So we loaded this texture in as an image. Now let's scroll all the way down, disable color, and enable displacement under geometry here. Default value is 0.2. Let's leave it at that. Let's go into camera view, and let's press F12 and render it and see what it looks like so far. Doesn't look like anything changed. Because displacement maps actually affect the mesh itself, the mesh has to be more detailed. Because right now, there's only, 8 vertices on this, so there's not enough detail for a displacement map to work with. So we're either going to have to subdivide this a couple times or add a subsurf modifier. So let's add the modifier. Go to the modifier buttons, click on Add Modifier, and choose Subdivision Surface. You'll see it automatically smooths the whole thing out into a sphere. We don't want that. That's not the kind of subdivision we want. So change it from Catmull-Clark to Simple Subsurf. If you go into wireframe view, you can see what Simple Subsurf Modifier does. It basically just subdivides the cube, or whatever object you added to. It doesn't smooth it out or anything. It just subdivides it. So let's increase the render subdivisions to 6, which is the maximum. So it's going to have this much detail for the displacement texture to work with. But the cool thing is, we don't have to keep the cube that detailed in the 3D view. If we did, it would start to slow things down. But we can change the view subdivisions to 0, or we can simply and hide that from the 3D view, but it will still render as 6 subdivisions. So now press F12 and let's see what happens. There we go. Everything's bumping inward now. So you can't really tell that it's affecting the mesh, because this could just still be a really good normal map or bump map. So let's go back to the textures. Man, it keeps doing that. If this happens to you when you go back to the textures and everything kind of disappears, remember that these 3 options here determine what options you see. So make sure you click on the material icon and you'll see all the options for that material's texture. So let's scroll down to the bottom and change displacement from 0.2 to negative 0.5. So it bumps the other way. Press F12. Let's see what happens. There we go. Now this is no illusion. You can obviously see that the mesh is being displaced. All of the vertices are moving up and down based on our displacement map. So the drawback to this is that the mesh needs a high amount of detail in order for the displacement map to look good. But the pros to this is that it actually affects the mesh. This is real detail here. Nothing's faked. In terms of detail, it's superior to a normal map and a bump map. But again, you're going to need a high amount of detail on the mesh for that to look good. And that about covers it.